The diamond was small, but it threw a desperate light across the dusty glass of the pawnshop counter. It was set in a simple gold wedding band, worn smooth with time. Beside it lay a thin gold chain, its links intricate and fine, clearly made by hands a world away from Redemption Creek, Nevada. Jedediah Stone watched the woman who had placed them there. She wore a dark red prairie dress, patched at the elbow but clean, the color of dried blood in the summer sun of 1878. Her black hair was pulled back severely, and her hands, which she now clasped in front of her, were trembling just enough to notice. Jedediah had only come in for a new whetstone, but the quiet drama at the counter held him by the door. The pawnbroker, a fleshy man named Fletcher, with sweat stains wringing the collar of his shirt, poked at the jewelry with a grimy finger. He squinted at the woman, his gaze lingering with an oily appraisal that had nothing to do with the gold, and everything to do with her being alone and Chinese. "This ain't worth much," Fletcher grunted, his voice thick with indifference. "The ring's old-fashioned. The chain's too delicate. $20 for the lot." The woman flinched as if struck. Jedediah saw her swallow, a small, tight movement in her throat. "Sir, the gold alone, it is worth more. The diamond—" "The diamond is cloudy," Fletcher cut her off. "Take it or leave it, lady. I ain't got all day." Jedediah's eyes drifted to the street outside. Two men were lounging against the shaded facade of the freight office across the way. Pike and Dobbs. They weren't men who idled without purpose. They worked for Amos Blackwood, the man who owned the freight office, the bank, and the mortgage on nearly every soul in Redemption Creek. They weren't watching the pawn shop. They were watching the woman. A cold knot formed in Jedediah's gut. He knew this kind of play. It was the slow, patient circling of vultures over a weakened animal. The woman, May Chin, drew a breath that seemed to cost her something. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She had no other choice, and everyone in the room knew it. "I will take it," she whispered, the words barely audible over the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. But Fletcher didn't move to get the money. He leaned forward, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Or," he said, his voice dropping low, "we could make another arrangement. A woman like you, alone, you must have other things to offer." The air in the small shop went still and sour. May Chin took a half step back, her face a mask of stone, but her eyes were wide with a trapped sort of panic. She was about to be robbed twice over, once of her property and once of her dignity. Jedediah had seen enough. He let the door swing shut with a soft click that sounded like a cocked hammer in the silence. He took 3 long, deliberate strides to the counter. He was not a large man, but he moved with an economy that made people pay attention. He placed a worn leather pouch on the counter, the coins inside making a heavy, final sound. "She won't be taking your $20, Jedediah said, his voice level and calm. He didn't look at Fletcher. His gaze was on the 2 pieces of jewelry glittering on the counter. "And she won't be taking any other offers." Fletcher straightened up, his face flushing a blotchy red. "This ain't your business, Stone." Jedediah finally looked at him. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth at all. "It is now." He pushed the pouch toward May Chin. "Ma'am, I don't know much about jewels, but I know what a man's last hope looks like. There's $100 in there. Gold coin. Is that a fairer price?" May stared at him, her suspicion a visible shield. In a town like this, kindness from a stranger, a white stranger, was more dangerous than open hostility. It always came with a hidden cost. She looked from his calm face to the pouch, then back again. Fletcher was sputtering, but Jedediah ignored him. He gently separated the ring and chain from the pawnbroker's side of the counter and pushed them toward her as well. "Take your things, ma'am, and the money," he said quietly. "You're selling too low." For a long moment she just stood there, caught between two different kinds of threats. Then, with a jerky, decisive nod, she scooped the jewelry into a small cloth bag, took the leather pouch, and without another word, turned and fled the shop. The bell above the door gave a frantic jingle as she disappeared into the blinding sunlight. Jedediah watched her go, then turned his attention back to the fuming pawnbroker. "You tell Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that his dogs are getting sloppy." He turned and walked out, leaving Fletcher speechless and red-faced in the sudden quiet of his shop. The afternoon heat hit him like a physical blow, but it was not the only trouble waiting for him on the street. Pike and Dobbs detached themselves from the wall of the freight office and started across the dusty thoroughfare. Their boots kicked up little puffs of alkali dust, and their hands hung loose near the pistols on their hips. They moved to block Jedediah's path, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and menace. The street, which had been humming with the low-level activity of a summer afternoon, grew quiet. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. A farmer stopped his wagon. Everyone knew who Pike and Dobbs were, and everyone knew the quiet man they were facing. "Stone," Pike said, stopping a few feet away. He was the taller of the two, with a long, sunburnt face and teeth stained brown from tobacco. "Mr. Blackwood hears you're taking an interest in his business." "I was just buying a whetstone," Jedediah replied, his body relaxed, his hands empty and still at his sides. "Shop was out." Dobbs, a shorter, thicker man, chuckled humorlessly. "Funny. Looked like you were interfering in a private transaction. Mr. Blackwood don't like interference, especially not when it concerns strays." The word hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Jedediah's gaze didn't flicker. "That stray is a woman selling her own property. Last I checked, this was still Nevada, not Blackwood's private kingdom." "Things change," Pike said, taking a slow step closer, "and folks who don't change with 'em tend to get left behind. Or buried. Mr. Blackwood just wants what's fair. He had an arrangement concerning that woman's property." "I saw the arrangement," Jedediah said. "It looked a lot like theft." Pike's eyes narrowed. "You got a big reputation, Stone, but a reputation don't stop a bullet." He let his hand drop, his fingers brushing the worn handle of his Colt. It was the oldest move in the book, a lazy threat meant to spook a man into showing his hand. Jedediah didn't move a muscle. He just watched, his stillness a profound and unnerving counter-argument. He knew that the first man to lose his temper was the first man to die. Then a sound from behind him broke the tension, a soft scraping of leather on wood. He didn't turn, but he shifted his weight, ever so slightly. It was Mei Chin. She hadn't run far. She stood on the edge of the boardwalk, not 10 feet away. In her right hand, held low against the folds of her red dress, was a heavy black iron skillet she must have been carrying in her satchel. She said nothing. Her face was calm, her eyes fixed on Pike and Dobbs. She wasn't looking at Jedediah for rescue. She was watching the threat, her knuckles white around the handle of the skillet. She looked like a woman who had been backed into corners before and had learned that the only way out was to fight with whatever she had. It was a small gesture, a piece of cookware against two armed men, but it was an astonishing act of courage. It changed the geometry of the entire street. She was not a victim to be saved. She was a partner in the fight. Pike and Dobbs saw it too. Their bravado faltered. Intimidating a lone woman was one thing. Intimidating a quiet gunslinger was another. But being caught in a public standoff with a gunslinger and a Chinese woman holding the frying pan, that was just starting to look ridiculous. Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "This ain't over, Stone," he grumbled. but the threat was hollow now. He and Dobbs exchanged a look, then turned and lumbered back toward the freight office. The show was over. The town seemed to exhale all at once. The farmer clicked to his horse, and the shopkeepers vanished back into the shadows of their stores. Jedediah finally turned to Mei Chin. The skillet was still in her hand. "You should have kept running," he said, his voice softer than before. She lifted her chin. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cool fire. "You paid a fair price," she said, her English precise and careful. "It is not right for a fair man to be cheated by thieves." He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the strength that held her small frame rigid, the intelligence in her dark eyes. He nodded toward the end of the street, where the town gave way to dusty lots and scrub brush. "Where are you headed?" "Home," she said simply. "I'll walk with you," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew Blackwood's men would be back, and they wouldn't be so easily discouraged next time. As they started walking, the sun beating down on their heads, he couldn't shake the image of her standing there with that skillet. He had intervened to save a helpless woman, but he was beginning to realize that Mei Chin was anything but helpless. What he did not yet know was that the land she was leading him to was the real reason Blackwood's shadow loomed so large over them both. Her home was a small, clapboard house that stood defiantly on a 5-acre plot at the edge of town. It was little more than a shack, but it was meticulously kept. The windows were clean, the single step to the porch was swept, and a small, vibrant vegetable garden grew in neat rows beside the house, a patch of determined green in a world of brown dust. A hand-dug well with a simple wooden covering stood near the back. Inside, the house was sparse but spotless. A small table, 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, and a small cooking stove. May moved with a quiet efficiency, setting a kettle on the stove and taking 2 cups from a shelf. She didn't speak until the water was hot, and she had poured 2 cups of pale, fragrant tea. She pushed one toward Jedediah. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his. The shield of suspicion was gone, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "You did not have to do that." "Blackwood's men were circling," he said, cradling the warm cup in his hands. "I've seen what happens next." "Mr. Blackwood wants this land," she stated, not as a complaint, but as a fact. "My husband, Way, he filed a claim on it, under the Homestead Act." Jedediah looked around the small room, then out the window at the dusty plot. It didn't look like much. "Why this piece?" "The water," she said, and her voice held a note of pride. "The well never runs dry. It taps into a deep spring. It is the only reliable water for 2 miles in any direction. Way was a laborer for the railroad, but he was not a fool. He learned English. He learned the law. He saw this land on a survey map and knew its value." A piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Jedediah. Blackwood wasn't just bullying a widow for a worthless patch of dirt. He was making a play for the most valuable resource in the territory. "Your husband," Jedediah began, choosing his words carefully. "The railroad." "He died 2 months ago," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They said it was an accident. A coupling broke on a freight car. But he was careful, always careful." She paused, then rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. She returned with a sheaf of papers and a worn, folded letter. "This is the deed," she said, handing him the official document from the Territorial Land Office. It looked legitimate, the seals and signatures all in place. "And this is from Way." He took the letter. The paper was soft, the creases worn through from repeated folding and unfolding. It was written in a careful, elegant script. It was a love letter, full of quiet affection and plans for their future on this small piece of land. But the last paragraph was different. "May," it read, Be watchful of the freight master, Mr. Blackwood. He has asked about the spring. He smiles, but his eyes are hungry. He is not an honorable man. If anything should happen to me, do not sell the land. The water is our future. It is your independence. Jedediah folded the letter and handed it back to her. He was a smart man. He was a good man, she corrected softly. She put the papers away, her movements precise and deliberate. I was selling my mother's ring to pay the lawyer in Carson City, to make sure the filing is ironclad, and to buy seed for next year. So, the $20 Fletcher had offered wouldn't have been enough for any of it. It would have been just enough to make her fail. It was all part of Blackwood's plan to squeeze her out. The sound of an approaching horse broke the quiet. It was a single rider, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Jedediah was on his feet instantly, his body angled toward the door, his hand resting on the back of his chair, inches from his pistol. May watched him, her composure unwavering. The rider who dismounted in front of the small house was not Pike or Dobbs. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest. A U.S. Marshal. His eyes swept over the homestead, taking in the house, the garden, and Jedediah standing in the doorway. "Jedediah Stone," the marshal called out, his voice calm and authoritative. Jedediah felt a familiar coldness settle in his stomach. The past had a long reach. He stepped out onto the porch, into the unforgiving sunlight, leaving May in the shadows of the house. "I'm Stone." The marshal nodded slowly. "Marshal Brody, I have a warrant for your arrest from the territory of Kansas. A shooting in a saloon in Dodge City 3 years back." Jedediah didn't deny it. He just stood there, his face unreadable. He had been looking over his shoulder for 3 years. He'd just never expected the law to find him here, now. "I'm not resisting, Marshal," he said quietly. Brody's gaze shifted to the road leading back to town. 2 riders were approaching, Pike and Dobbs, and behind them a man in a buggy, Amos Blackwood himself. The marshal looked from the approaching men back to Jedediah, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Looks like you've got other troubles today, son," Brody said, his tone dry. Blackwood pulled his buggy to a halt. He was a man in his 50s, dressed in a fine suit despite the heat, his face smooth and his smile practiced. He tipped his hat to the marshal before turning his cold eyes on Jedediah and then on May, who had stepped out to stand beside him. "Marshal," Blackwood said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "A pleasure. I trust you're here to help keep the peace." He held up a document. "I've come to take possession of my property. This woman is a squatter. I have a deed of sale signed by her late husband." He handed the paper to Brody. The marshal examined it, his expression giving nothing away. He then looked at May. "Ma'am, do you have a claim to this land?" "I do," May said, her voice clear and strong. She held out the papers Way had left her. "A homestead claim, filed and approved 4 months ago. My husband never sold this land." Blackwood chuckled, a condescending, dismissive sound. "A misunderstanding. Her husband sold it to me just before his unfortunate accident. His signature is right there." Jedediah looked at the deed in the marshal's hand. The signature was a crude imitation of the elegant script in Way's letter. More than that, he noticed something else. The date on Blackwood's deed was a week after the date on Way's letter, but a day before the railroad accident. It was a clumsy forgery. "Marshal," Blackwood said, his voice hardening, "this is a simple matter of property law. I want this woman and this gunman off my land by sundown. The town sheriff is here to assist." He gestured to the 4th rider who had accompanied them, a man with a tin star and shifty eyes who refused to meet Jedediah's gaze. Marshal Brody looked from the false deed to the legitimate one. He looked at Blackwood's smug face, at the nervous sheriff, and at the 2 hired guns. Then he looked at Jedediah Stone, a wanted man, and May Chen, a widow with nothing but a piece of paper and a patch of green vegetables. He was the law, but the law in these parts was often just a matter of who had more guns. He handed both deeds back to their owners. "This is a civil matter," Brody said, his voice flat, "but Mr. Blackwood has made a request. You have until sundown to vacate, ma'am, or the sheriff will be forced to evict you." It was a death sentence. Blackwood had won. With the law on his side, there was nothing to be done. May's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of despair. Jedediah had his choice. He could go with the marshal, let the law take its course. Kansas was a long way off. Or he could run, disappear again. But when he looked at May, at the fight draining from her eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away. He had started this. He turned to Marshal Brody. "Marshal, my business in Kansas can wait," he said, his voice ringing with a new authority. "This business here needs settling. I'm not leaving." Brody looked at him for a long, hard moment. He saw the resolution in Jedediah's face. He saw the fight wasn't over. It was a foolish, costly choice. By defying a legal order, Jedediah was adding another crime to his name. But something in the way the man stood his ground, in the quiet dignity of the woman beside him, gave the marshal pause. "Sundown, Stone," Brody said, his voice a low warning. He swung back onto his horse. "I'll be in town. Don't make me come looking for you." He rode off, leaving them alone with Blackwood's final, triumphant smile. The choice had been made. Jedediah had just traded his freedom for a few more hours on a dusty plot of land next to a woman he barely knew. 3 months later, the autumn sun was warm on May Chen's garden. The rows of vegetables were heavy with produce, and the patch of green had expanded. The well, her well, was the center of it all, a source of life that now served not just her, but several of her neighbors who came to buy her fresh food and draw water for a small fee. The confrontation at sundown had not been the bloody shootout everyone expected. When Blackwood returned with the sheriff and his men, ready for a fight, they found Jedediah and May waiting on the porch, with Marshal Brody sitting on his horse nearby, watching. Jedediah had not drawn his gun. He had used words. He calmly pointed out to the marshal that the signature on Blackwood's deed was a poor forgery. But the decisive blow had come from May. Using the money Jedediah had given her, she had done more than just hire a lawyer. She had sent a telegraph to the Territorial Land Office. The reply had arrived that very afternoon, brought by the marshal himself. It was a certified confirmation of her homestead claim, complete with a warning that the plot was under federal protection and that any competing claims were to be investigated for fraud. Faced with a federal marshal holding a telegraph that exposed his entire scheme, Blackwood's authority crumbled. The forgery was plain as day. The sheriff, seeing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly remembered other duties in town. Marshal Brody, his face like granite, arrested Amos Blackwood for land fraud and conspiracy. An investigation into Wei Chen's accident was opened, and Pike and Dobbs, realizing their employer was finished, had vanished overnight. Now Jedediah stood by the garden fence, his horse saddled and ready. Marshal Brody waited for him a short distance away. The business in Redemption Creek was settled, but the warrant from Kansas remained. "The trial might go hard," Jedediah said, not looking at May. "You told the marshal it was self-defense," she replied, her hands busy tying a small cloth parcel. "He believes you. He will tell the judge what you did here." "He might," Jedediah allowed. "Or he might just see a man with a reputation who finally ran out of luck." She finished with the parcel and held it out to him. It was heavy and smelled of baked bread and dried meat. "This is for your journey." She then pressed a folded piece of paper into his other hand. "And this is for the judge." He opened it. It was a letter, written in the same precise English she spoke, testifying to his character. It described how he had stood for her when no one else would, how he had faced down a powerful man, not with violence, but with courage. He looked up from the letter and met her eyes. In the pawn shop, her hands had trembled. Now they were steady and strong, lightly calloused from her work in the garden. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the hardened skin. It was the hand of a survivor, the hand of a homesteader. "I'll be back," he said. It was not a promise made lightly. It was a statement of intent, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. Mei Chen simply nodded, a small, certain smile touching her lips. "I will be here," she said. He swung up into his saddle and turned his horse toward the road, Marshal Brody falling in beside him. He did not look back. He didn't need to. Courage, he was beginning to understand, wasn't about being the fastest gun. It was about finding something, or someone, worth standing for, even when the cost was everything you had. And sometimes, redemption wasn't found in outrunning your past, but in turning to face it, fortified by the quiet promise of a future waiting for you back home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.